It's Friday, August 30th, 2024, and we are 66 days away from the election. Welcome to today's episode of Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. On the show today, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz sit down for their very first interview since accepting the nominations, and there is a lot to talk about. But before that, let's get to the headlines. Earlier this week, NASA announced that the two astronauts who have been stranded on the International Space Station will be there until the next SpaceX supply craft can reach them next February. Now, NASA doesn't like to use the word stranded, but that's what it is. What was supposed to be an 8-day mission has now turned into an 8-month mission. For these astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, the pair left Earth on a Boeing Starliner. It was a test flight of the new spacecraft, but when they were getting ready to come home, they started to have issues with thrusters and some other things like a delay in the parachute deployment system, which, I don't know, seems important to me. So NASA, as well as Wilmore and Williams, decided they should stay up there. It's unclear what else they'll be doing while they're there. This was also a huge setback for Boeing, which is having a terrible year. NASA was on the verge of paying the aerospace giant $4.2 billion to make annual 4-person trips to orbit, and now that is, if you'll excuse the pun here, very much up in the air. On Wednesday, the billionaire owner of the messaging app Telegram, Pavel Durov, was indicted after being held for 4 days in a French jail. He's been charged with multiple crimes like aiding the spread of child pornography, drug trafficking, as well as breaking European laws about reporting and monitoring crimes on social media. Telegram has more than 900 million users worldwide, and it generally features large chat room-style groups. It's widely used in places like Iran, where the government cracks down on communication, and it's a popular place for Ukrainians to get their news about the war. It's also a place where groups like white nationalists and extremists have been found to trying to coordinate and plan their attacks, including those responsible for January 6th. While Durov was born in Russia, he has citizenship and passports for France, the United Arab Emirates, and he just bought citizenship to the small Caribbean nation of St. Kitts and Nevis. The arrest has been criticized by First Amendment advocates and tech leaders, including Elon Musk, who owns X, which used to be Twitter. Durov's lawyer called it ridiculous, and he's been ordered to remain in France until a full investigation is complete. Also on Wednesday, the Supreme Court stopped the Biden administration from going forward with its latest attempt to forgive hundreds of millions of dollars in student loans to millions of Americans. The court ruled without dissent that the Biden administration could not restart the program while it's still on appeal in a different circuit court of appeals. The program went through what's called the SAVE Act, and it would have erased up to $20,000 in loan debt per student, in some cases wiping out their monthly payments. This is the second time that the Supreme Court justices have ruled against the Biden administration's attempts to make a dent in the student loan crisis. They said in this week's ruling they expect the appeals court to make a speedy ruling of its own. Finally, the Paris Paralympic Games got started on Thursday. The opening ceremony was directed by the same person as the Olympics, and it was featured in the heart of Paris again, although the athletes did not travel down the River Seine this time. Roughly 4,000 athletes will compete across 23 different sports and games like blind soccer, para-sport shooting, para-swimming, wheelchair basketball, and wheelchair fencing. Medals have already been given out in some of the swimming events, along with para-taekwondo. So far, the Olympic Committee says more than 2 million tickets have been sold to people from across 144 different countries, and they expect ticket sales to beat the record set at the 2016 Games in Rio. Okay, that is it for your headlines. Let's get to the main story this week. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz take questions for the first time. So last night, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz sat down with CNN's Dana Bash, which I think I accidentally mispronounced as Dana in yesterday's Mims Mini. It's Dana, not Dana. I'm sorry about that. But they covered a lot of ground in an hour, from Harris's 2020 campaign and her stances then and the ones that have changed, to her time spent in the Biden White House, to how she landed on Tim Walz. Now, Walz also fielded several questions about his record, his military record, and his family, but let's go through this from the beginning, and I'm not going to do this line by line, but we're just going to take a look at the answers that do deserve a closer look. So Harris was asked about her plan for day one. Now, Harris ran through what her campaign speech has been, specifically on economics, which are dominating this election. They usually do. The economy usually does dominate an election, but it's a bit more so this year. So Harris said she would work on lowering prices and touted the expanded child tax credit. I've talked about both of those things before. She wants to put price gouging controls on specifically groceries, and also wants to expand the child tax credit to give every family $6,000 per kid for the first year of that child's life. And Harris talked a lot about the policies of the Biden administration, too. At one point, Bash specifically asked her about her plan to reduce prices and make housing more affordable, and why those things hadn't been done in the last 3.5 years. This was sort of a recurring theme of the interview. Now, Harris was pretty open in those moments, and there were a few of them, like I said. Harris said the health of the economy, or lack thereof, when she and Biden were elected, was on the Trump administration. And the reason they hadn't implemented any of the plans she's talking about was because the economy needed to recover. She said inflation is now under 3%, and the U.S. recovered better than any other major nation on the planet. Both of those things are true currently, and at least that second part has been true for a long time by almost every person who's looked at it. I know that's cold comfort when eggs are really expensive, but that is something to pay attention to. So this also led to a less than stellar set of answers in this interview from Harris that her campaign is certainly going to tweak their approach before the debate. Harris was asked whether she thought Bidenomics worked, which is what the Biden economic suite of plans was called. That's a tough sell, given the spike in inflation and the rise in prices across the last 3 years. Now, Harris tried to pivot that to an answer on the Biden administration's success in getting Medicare to be able to negotiate drug prices and capping the price of insulin at $35. She tried to jam in here the thing that politicians do, which is say that they've been talking to folks on the campaign trail who have told them all about these things that they want fixed. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. They know that journalists aren't either going to be able to find that person again, or they won't do the work to find that one person at a diner in Savannah, Georgia, or a suburb in Michigan, so they lie to make a point. Trump does this all the time, by the way, too. He has a huge tell. Usually it's any story where he says someone called him sir. That is one of these stories where it's probably a little bit untrue, if not wholly untrue. But in the case of Harris, her answer here, it was clunky and it just really didn't land. But that answer then set up a section of the interview where Harris could have shown some real policy mastery and instead chose to stop short, which, again, like I said, made her answers clunky and just a little bit hard to follow. And when those things happen, those are choices in the prep that the campaign has done for an interview like this. So she was asked about her stance on fracking in 2019, which she said she wanted to ban it then. Since then, she's reversed her stance. She actually reversed it in the 2020 campaign, and she told Bash that she'd seen that the clean energy or green energy technology that Democrats want to see used more worked. The thing to know here is fracking, which is the process of pulling natural gas out of the ground by splitting rock deposits underground, is a huge deal in Pennsylvania, specifically the swing state this election. It's also been linked to numerous health issues and environmental issues, including earthquakes in places that aren't designed or built to withstand them. And those things are partly why Democrats are against it. Now, Harris was pushed again on why she changed her mind, and I'll be honest here, I'm more interested in a why a candidate changed their mind. Other than that they did, we should want politicians who represent us, who get new information, to be able to change their minds. That isn't just based on whatever polling is popular. But that aside, Harris didn't give an example of that. She tried to pivot to the Inflation Reduction Act, which was actually the massive climate bill for the Biden administration, and she wound up saying that her values haven't changed on climate change despite that stance changing. It was easily her worst answer of the interview, and it wasn't even the hardest topic, because next was immigration, where the questions were similar to the economy. Why the things she's proposing to get done didn't get done in the last 3 years. Now, this was something her campaign had clearly prepped her for. She talked about the fact she was in charge of working with Northern Central American countries on immigration, and it just took time for that work to actually set in. And then she quickly pivoted to the immigration bill that was negotiated with Biden and conservative Republicans earlier this year. That was the one that Trump tanked because he didn't want to give Biden a win in an election year. I've talked about it before. She promised to re-up that bill and get it back on her desk so that she could sign it should she be elected. It's an effective strategy, this pivot to this bill, and it's one that she has clearly practiced. That bill, if you don't remember, would have hired more Border Patrol agents and immigration judges and done various other things to strengthen the border, but it would also have made the asylum process easier to navigate, which means, in theory, the U.S. would see fewer undocumented crossings. And her answer here on the immigration topic as a whole was honestly pretty good, and it was about where she got her feet back underneath her as Bash kept moving on immigration. She really leaned into her past as a prosecutor and said that as president, she would uphold the law. Now, here too was something from the 2020 campaign that came back to haunt her a little bit. She was asked about why she said she would decriminalize the border. She had raised her hand on stage and during one of the primary debates when the question was asked about who would want to do that. Harris straight up ignored that and leaned into her history again as a prosecutor in California who put away drug dealers and gun runners. I don't know if it went far enough to convince voters that she didn't totally flip on her previous stance, but she clearly is staking out that she is somebody who is going to follow the law, but also wants to rework immigration law. So that was pretty much it for the domestic policy answers. And there were a few standalone questions which gave some interesting insights too. The big one was that she said that she would consider appointing a Republican to her cabinet. Now, she said she didn't have anybody in mind. This campaign is just way too short and moving too fast, and she's just focused on getting elected. But she said that she thinks it's important to be able to be somebody who can build consensus and have consensus, and to see that in her administration. Again, this is one of those things that politicians say because it sounds nice in the moment they say them, but when push comes to shove, they can and are often just sort of waved away. She was also asked about Trump's racist attack on her earlier this month, saying that she became black all of a sudden. Now, Harris just said it's the same old story and then just said, next question. It was the only time that Trump was actually asked about in that way, but throughout her answers, Harris would occasionally bring Trump up more as an idea rather than somebody specific on their policies. She said he was indicative of an era in politics and marked an era in politics where the American character was being denigrated. And she also said that she thinks that Americans want to move past that, which is a more succinct version of the speech she gave at the DNC, so we'll see if it resonates the same way with voters. On foreign policy, the question was Gaza, and Harris said she would staunchly still be in favor of Israel's right to defend itself and wouldn't waver on that. She also said that she wasn't in support of stopping the sale of arms to Israel, but did say that it's her vision to have a two-state solution where Palestinians have self-determination. That's a line right from her acceptance speech. Whether that's enough for pro-Palestinian Democrats who have been unhappy, to say the least, with the Biden administration approach to Gaza, we'll see. The answer to that, however, is likely no. At this point, Dana Bash pivots to Walz and asked him a question or two for a bit, specifically starting with his comment where he said he carried weapons in war. I've talked about this before. He said he misspoke and then said it happened while he was passionately talking about the Parkland High School shooting. Walz was stationed in Italy during the War on Terror in the early 2000s and did not see combat. He was also asked about his misstatements about using IVF and a DUI that happened 30 years ago that his 2006 campaign for Congress was caught lying about. Walz and his wife Gwen used a process known as IUI, or intrauterine insemination, not IVF as he said in the past. This is one of those things, kind of like the way that he's talking about his service, in which it seems to be in these interviews and these conversations, he's just choosing the easier to understand option than correcting somebody in that moment, which would derail the conversation or the interview. That doesn't necessarily make it right that he didn't stop and correct somebody or didn't say it correctly the first time. It just sort of explains the thinking. On the drunk driving thing, Walz was a 31-year-old high school teacher and was caught driving drunk doing 96 in a 55. He ended up pleading guilty to reckless driving, lost his license for 90 days, and paid a $200 fine. Again, this was 1995 in the upper Midwest, so drinking and driving wasn't a big deal back then, or at least it wasn't the deal that it is now. But Walz said he did stop drinking after that incident. In the end, on both of those things, he said that he thinks that people know who he is, they know where his heart is, and his record of 40 years in public life is open. I don't know that people really care about those things in each particular case, more likely his response to them, and so I guess, like all these things, we'll see how people react to this. Then things got back to Harris, and they talked a bit about getting the call when Joe Biden dropped out of the race, and honestly, I'm not going to get into that, nor the thing that Walz said about his son Gus at the DNC. Not that it was bad, it was just kind of meh, and also those things were definitely more human moments for both of them, but this episode would just be too long if I went into all of that. The last thing I do want to talk about is the final question, though. It was about an iconic photo of Harris's grandniece looking up at her during her acceptance speech, and Harris was asked about the gravity of that photo, and she said she was humbled by it. The question, though, was specifically about how Harris understands race and gender in this particular campaign, and she didn't talk about that image as an avatar of race or gender. And I find this a little bit interesting, too. Harris has avoided, sometimes explicitly, talking about her race and gender in the context of history. She avoided it when she ran for president in 2020, except for one big moment when she talked about busing, and she mostly eschewed it when she became the vice president, which I think in the context of her candidacy now, the first woman of color to be nominated to be the top of a major party ticket, and potentially the first woman to be president and the first woman of color to be president. And her pushing these things aside, especially when asked about them explicitly, I think is a really interesting choice. I don't know what to make of it. I just think that it's worth noting. Overall, I thought the interview was kind of middle of the road. It wasn't the best interview I've ever seen in the world, but it certainly wasn't the worst. And there are clearly things that the campaign is looking to do and will be looking to fix before the debate, where that really is the big test of Harris and probably her mastery of policy, especially when she's pitted against Trump. Also, these interviews, these joint interviews, tend to be kind of awkward, partly because it's a joint interview and it's weird that one of them has to sit there and smile and nod while the other one is answering, and usually that's the vice presidential candidate who's got to do most of that. And then partly because they tend to be so wide-ranging because it's the first time the ticket is sat down with anybody that it's hard to really get down into depth and get past the campaign answers. This also isn't a media commentary podcast, but I was surprised there wasn't any mention of the threat to democracy from Dana Bash. It remains a priority issue for a lot of voters, and there wasn't any discussion of how a Harris presidency would bolster or restore Americans' faith in democracy and elections after it's been eroded for the last several election cycles. The other thing here, too, is, and like I said yesterday, it's worth putting this interview and the questions that were asked and Harris's responses to them up against almost any Trump interview in the last year or so, which have been on incredibly friendly networks, and questions have just sort of been lobbed across the plate for him. It's a small part put this in that context of thinking about the Harris-Walz interview, but it is worth keeping in mind. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit here. I had a different episode in mind for this week before the Harris-Walz interview was announced about this race coming together so fast and what it could mean for changes that we could see in American elections to make them more fair, to make them shorter, or just all around better for voters. So up next, I talked to the executive director of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, the founder of the civics organization Let's Fix This, and just an all-around really good guy, Andy Moore. And I do want to say, due to some technical issues, I was forced to use the webcam instead of my normal camera, so I'm sorry for the weird angle of this, but let's get to the interview. You and I have known each other for what at this point? Almost 10 years?
Almost. When did you move to Oklahoma City?
2015.
Okay, yeah. So, and we started Let's Fix This in 2016. So, probably about 8 years then. Yeah.
Yeah, 8 years.
9 years.
Both less gray and and
Oof, that's the truth, man. I
less
look back at
risen.
photos from 2016, before having a pandemic, having a baby, and losing both my parents, and I was like a shiny young chap.
Yeah, you were. Yes. Shiny and so dark. Uh, let's let's talk about Harris here. I want to get your take first and how you're feeling about this election. In 100 days, this election is being built, and we'll hit election day. It's been just over 6 weeks from when Joe Biden stepped out of the race, which feels like it should have been 6 years ago. But how are you feeling about this, and what are you watching?
Yeah, I think I'm watching the energy on both sides. I think the shift in Joe Biden stepping down and paving the way for Kamala Harris to become the nominee was a fundamental shift in the energy around this election on both sides, right? Certainly on the Democratic side, my Democratic friends and obviously just voters in general were not super enthused about voting for Biden again. I think many were willing to because the other side was too heavy of a burden to bear. But having Harris on the ticket really changes the calculus. And I think we see it on the Republican side as well, where the Trump campaign has been really trying to grapple with how to campaign against Harris when they had built their machine to campaign against Joe Biden. And so just now, really, since the conventions are over, I think both sides are starting to figure out where the battle lines are drawn and what the next, 8 weeks looks like.
Let's talk to you about the thing that you're actually here to talk about, because it's a thing that I've been thinking about because we have such a short race now, is that it really does, for me, open up ideas about election reforms. If we can do a presidential election in 100 days, there are a lot of other things that we could do to help make elections more competitive, make them less partisan, make them matter more or less, depending on what state you're talking about, but matter more equally, more equitably. So first, tell me about Nonpartisan Reformers, who you are, what you do, and why it's important that we look at these things.
Yeah. So I work with the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. And as the name suggests, we're an association of the many, many groups around the country that are working on what we call structural electoral reform. Now, that's a mouthful, but that essentially means we address how we structure our elections, like how we administer them, who's allowed to vote, when they're allowed to vote, to ensure that the system reflects the will of most voters and that it allows elections to be more fair, more representative, more equitable across the country, regardless of an individual voter's party affiliation or non-affiliation, right? There's a lot of interest right now, and I think it's worthwhile that the independent voter, unaffiliated voter demographic is the fastest growing voter group in the country. Many states, Colorado, Nevada, perhaps most notably, already have a majority of voters that are unaffiliated. And we're seeing that trend across the country, that this two-party duopoly, right, these two main parties, they kind of control everything from how the lines are drawn to who's allowed to vote in publicly funded elections. That system that's been in place for the last, 60 years is what we know now that it's not good for democracy. And so a lot of our members are working on subtle shifts, right? Adapting democracy, rebuilding it in a way that is better reflecting the 21st century we live in and voter preferences today.
What do you think is driving those independent voters and that group of voters to grow? Is it, and I'm forgetting the name of the professor and researcher from, I believe it's Berkeley or USC now, but she coined the term calcification rather than polarization. Do you think it's that sort of idea that it's not just that we have two parties and they are divided on either side and those are the choices, but it's that sort of the worst impulses of that kind of polarization have metastasized? Is that what's driving these independent voters here?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look back to beginning the 1950s or 60s, there's a trend that's been happening steadily, and it's just now is much more pronounced of this. I think calcification is a good term, but this sorting, right? This partisan sorting, where you used to have conservative and liberal Democrats and conservative and liberal Republicans, and that's not the case now. In present day America, your party affiliation is not just indicative, but like prescriptive of your position on a whole host of issues. And also, it is often prescriptive of your education level, of your income level, and of your race and ethnicity. There's a lot of stuff that have kind of aligned now. If you read books by Lee Drutman or David Daley, they go into really great detail about this and explaining how this transition has happened over the last 60, 70 years. And the problem now is that so few Americans have friends or colleagues outside of their partisan bubble, because that bubble is a perfect circle with all the other bubbles that they live in. And that means that as those bubbles become more calcified, they also move farther apart. And this trend towards disaffiliation from political parties is a lot of voters, like myself included, honestly, that look at both parties and say, neither one of these really represents me. Like, everyone's kind of grossed out by politics, by partisanship, and this expectation that we as voters somehow perfectly align with the party, and that is just not the case. So a lot of folks are just skeptical of those systems and are opting out and say, I'm going to vote for the candidates that I like best, that I think are best representative of my city or my state, and I think that's going to cause a real crisis inside one or both parties if they don't recognize that they're exclusionary towards a growing segment of the voters.
How do we make that change happen then? Because, I'm specifically thinking of things like Red Map, which, for the listeners who don't know what that is, that's 30, 40 years of Republican design for gerrymandering and candidate training to basically make districts that are solidly Republican. And when you get to those places, and Andy, you know this better than, so stop me when I'm wrong here, but like when you get to those places, you have to run candidates that are further and further to the fringe of your ideology for them to win. So how do you break out of that? Because it is so baked into American politics now that it almost seems like we can't get candidates who will reflect those voters, like you and I, who are like, yeah, there are things here from maybe both sides that I like, but I don't like the entire buffet here. I don't like everything on the menu. So how do we get there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Grant. And there's like a few things that I want to bullet point for listeners to keep in mind. One is that our current electoral system, especially our primary system, we think it's been this way forever, and it hasn't. Really, just since 1968 and really since 1970, do we have this publicly funded primary system where taxpayer dollars pay for it, and we use our taxpayer dollars to basically host popularity contests for two private companies, right? Which is what the parties are.
And by publicly funded, you mean that like our elections are run by public dollars. We're not funding candidates.
No, the election themselves, right? Like we pay for the ballots and the administrators and all that stuff. But the purpose of those elections is to elect it. Before that, the parties decided on their own, often with like smoky backroom deals, and it was very opaque. And that's not, like, we knew that was a problem, which is why we shifted after the 1968 election towards this more of an electoral process. And what we now know, 60 years of doing this, is that the system has been designed in a way that the parties have figured out how to use it for their own gain. And so a lot of the conversations around elections are about partisanship. And I would push back and say they're not so much about partisanship as they are about power, right? Republicans use the systems for their benefit when they're in power, just like Democrats do. You mentioned gerrymandering in a state like Oklahoma. The Republicans are in charge. They get to draw the maps under the current law. And so they do it to ensure that they will continue to win. Well, in Illinois, right, where Democrats held power, they drew the maps to ensure that they would stay in power in the same way. And so often when you get pushback from one party or the other, it's because their power is threatened. It's not a partisan issue, it's a power issue.
How do we get out of that? Is that, ranked choice voting? Is that open primaries? Is that ensuring that people have access to vote so that you get just more people heading to the ballot, and then parties, in theory, need to respond to that kind of a growth in the voting population? Is it all of those things? What are the options here that we have?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question too. And there's obviously not one silver bullet, but there are kind of a whole clip of bullets. I don't like the violence, but there's several options.
Like a dessert cart that rolls around of
There we
voting
go.
options.
A much better dessert cart. Everyone can get behind that. So two of the big things that get a lot of press, and I think with good reason, are open primaries and ranked choice voting. And especially when those are combined together into a system that's often referred to as like Final Five or maybe Final Four, which is the Alaska style model now. And I'll talk a little bit about that as a whole. But what they do is open primaries would be the reverse of what we have now, where many states have closed primaries where only people of a political party can vote in their own party's primaries. And that blocks everybody else out, often including independent voters. And so often you have very consequential elections that are decided by a tiny, tiny measure of voters.
Parties do usually push back against this, though, right? Because in the idea that like it means curtailing their power in some way.
Right.
So how do you get around that part of this too?
Well, people got to let go of their power, Grant. I mean, that's really where it comes down to. Is that
it's so simple.
This democracy shouldn't be about the power of a few, right? It should be about the preferences of the many.
Yeah. Explain too for people who don't know what ranked choice voting is.
Yeah. It gets cast as being confusing, and it's not, right? Grant, if I ask you, what are your top 3 favorite flavors of ice cream, what would you say?
I will go with straight up chocolate, number 1, cookies and cream, and then strawberry.
All right. Chocolate, cookies and cream, strawberry. If you walk into a ice cream shop and they're out of chocolate, then you pick
cookies and
cream. Right? Okay, great. That's ranked choice voting. That's all it is. We do this all the time. We think about things. My top choice is this, but if they don't have that, I want this next one. And that's all it is. Just for candidates, right? So you walk into the ballot booth and maybe there's 7 candidates and you say, I like this one most, and then I like this one second most, and on down. And you can just pick one if you want. You can rank, 4, 5, or 7, whatever you want to do, whatever you feel like represents your preferences. And then when they tabulate it, it's the same way. They tabulate, and if one candidate gets a majority, they win. That's how it works right now. If no candidate gets a majority, then they figure out who got the fewest votes, like who was the obvious loser, and they throw them out. And then all of those voters' second preferences, right? Like people who picked the lowest one, they had someone else who was second, and they really redistribute those. So we get what's called a consensus candidate, right? It shows us who is the candidate that most voters wanted.
Before I let you go here, I want to ask you too, because every time I've talked to you about these things, or I hear you talk about these things, or read what you write, I leave more hopeful about democracy and civics. And I think a lot of people watching this election cycle and watching politics in general leave those interactions feeling less hopeful. So how do you hang on to that? How do you hang on to the hope that we can be better because people want to be better?
Well, thank you for saying that. I admit I don't always embody that optimism every day as much as I wish that I would. But I think for me, the thing that gives me hope is honestly talking to voters, right? Like we here in Oklahoma, I'm out almost every week doing something in the community, whether it's voter registration or get out the vote or training or whatever. And even as I travel the country, talking to voters and to elected officials, I think the sentiment that comes through from almost everybody is that they really believe in America. They believe in the fabric of our society. They believe in the kind of fundamental shared values that our country has and has had from the beginning. We've got some work to do on the edges for sure, right? But this American spirit of like, we can set the tone for democracy in the rest of the world. We always have, right? And this year is a very consequential opportunity for us to re-up our commitment to democracy, for us to truly be a leader in that. And I don't think it's beyond the pale of a possibility that we can reclaim that position as the best democracy in the world. But it does mean that we have to come together and find ways to work through our differences to change the system to better align the incentives that politicians face with the needs and the desires of the community. But as more and more voters tune in and say, you know what, I have more agency than I act like, let's step in, let's do it. I think that the next 50, 100 years of America, the future looks very bright.
Well, Andy Moore, thank you for coming on the show and refilling my well of optimism. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Grant. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you again to Andy for coming on the show. If you're interested in the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, there's a link in the description. If you're one of our listeners in Oklahoma or you just want to know what's going on inside Texas's hat, he's got a podcast. It's great. And speaking of podcasts, that is it for this one, at least today. Don't forget to rate and review the show on your preferred podcast app. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube if you want to watch this instead and not just listen. Don't forget to share the show at MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod. It's all one word on every platform. And while you're online, just hop over to the Make It Make Sense Substack and subscribe there too. There's bonus content, including an extended interview with Andy today and a fact check of last night's interview. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.